All right. Apparently we've been live for 12 seconds and I didn't even know it because my computer is lagging. So welcome, Allie, to the Trauma Informed Educators Network podcast. I'm just excited to talk to you. I have followed you on social media simply because you have the best Instagram handle of anyone I've ever seen, and that is _misbehavior. I was like, yes, that is an awesome handle. So welcome. And, I start this off the same way every time. Just tell us the Allie, and I'm going to say it confidently. Are you ready? Suzinski story.
You did
How's
it.
That?
I would love to tell you the Allie Suzinski story. So my name is Allie, and in 2006, I graduated high school and I started college, and I went to Illinois State University and I studied special education. My mom was a special education teacher for like 30 years and clearly influenced me. And I went to the same college as her, all of that. Didn't live in the same dorm. I lived in a really old, kind of junky dorm that was old when she went there. So, I mean, it's gone now, but anyway. Studied special education, and when I graduated, I had my degree in Illinois. We get certified in kindergarten through age 21 in special education across all areas of special ed except for deaf, hard of hearing, and blind, visually impaired students. And those are different designations just because they require so much specialized knowledge. And of course, I've had some students within those areas in my years of teaching, but not specific. So I went straight into teaching in the Chicago public school system, and I taught students that had multiple disabilities, which means a lot of things. A lot of my students had autism, Down syndrome, intellectual disabilities. And as time went on, because it's a big urban district and funds kind of ebb and flow constantly, I started getting this influx of students that had the disability label of emotional disability, which I found really interesting because it didn't really fit the mold, but really found a love for these specific students. And when I left that school district and moved to a different one just north of the city of Chicago, I started working in a public school that is actually also home to children that are in the foster care system that actually did not succeed in foster care. So they're living in a residential treatment facility because they'd been in, some of them, 6 to 10 failed foster placements due typically to behavior. And so the school district kind of embodied them and embraced this little children's home that was within their boundaries. And it became the district therapeutic day school for kids within the district that had emotional behavior disorders that kind of required that specialized instruction. And the students that were there that needed that level of support just kind of stayed. And I was one of their teachers. So it's really interesting. That doesn't really happen where that's part of the public school system, but I found it and I really did love it. It was a big challenge, but it was really fun. I then was a special ed consultant for a few years, and now I am an SEL coach in a public school district, which is a totally new role for me and the district, but it's been really fun. And yeah, within all of that, I started my misbehavior account, which I share a lot about behavior and a lot about ethical behavior practices and trauma-informed education and practices, things I'm passionate about, what I'm learning in those aspects, how to infuse SEL into your classroom, what I'm reading. I love books. I live in Chicago with my husband and our daughter and our like myriad of pets. And yeah, that's the Allie story right now.
Well, that is awesome. And wow, what a experience. And for those of you who are listening, I'm sorry, I think there's a lag in the internet, and I apologize for those of you who are watching. For those of you who are listening to the podcast, it really doesn't bother you at all. But nonetheless, as a previous foster parent of 2 years, what a captivating idea, right? Because I learned very quickly that, wow, what perspective schools take simply by knowing that a child is in foster care. And expectations based off of that life experience That is, in all honesty, is disheartening in a lot of ways. And handling of that, it's just I didn't realize that was your background and experience. So that speaks to me deeply for sure. So let's talk about this SEL coach, right? I think that there's this conversation that's happening all of the time. And matter of fact, I've had many of these. How does social and emotional learning, which I like to call social and emotional health because it's really about health. But anyway, social and emotional learning and trauma-informed education, how do you describe those things and how do they fit together, or what's the correlation?
Sure. So I think that we see these buzzword kind of terms almost. They feel like buzzwords now. I don't know that they always were, but I think they are now. And I think that globally as an education community, we think that they're really nuanced and really specific and only for specific children or specific instances. But I think it's really important to demystify that idea and just say, like, those are just best practices, period. Right? You have no idea what kids in your classroom are, at home are struggling with emotional regulation unless their grown up at home has disclosed that to you, right? Or you have some information from that child, or it's kind of carrying over into the classroom. There's no way that you would really know that. You're not going to know what the child is bringing in. Are their parents going through a divorce? Have they witnessed some type of violence? Have they, you're not going to know that unless it's been disclosed to you. There's just simply no way. And that's really not our role. And I've learned that from so many scholars across the board. And I'm the first person to say that I'm guilty of saying, like, the moment that I walked in there, I'm like, give me their files. I need to know everything about them. No, I don't. I really did not need to know any of that. What I needed to know was, what are the best practices? How can I make this classroom safe, regardless of if you were a child slave or if you were a kid that was raised in a home that has a pretty boring, typical childhood. I want you to feel safe all the time. It really doesn't matter. I want this is a baseline for all kids. So I want the kids that are going to feel safe because they've had really comfortable relationships. I want every kid to feel that way in this space. What can I do to do that? Well, I can talk about emotions. I can model healthy coping skills because every kid's going to feel anxiety at school. Every kid's going to get frustrated with a math problem. It really doesn't matter. Every kid's going to say, like, hey, I didn't sleep well last night. I had a weird dream. That's just a totally normal human experience, right? We want kids to know what to do when they have an emotion, because we're people, right? We're people that ebb and flow and change all the time. And classrooms are emotional places. So we want all kids to just feel safe regardless. When it comes to trauma-informed practices, I do think that there's some pieces where you can really go above and beyond. You can change the layout of your classroom depending on the experiences of some of your kids, or some things that you could do that are a little bit more, just have a little bit more oomph to them. And you can do that just based on kind of how you see how your classroom plays out. It doesn't need to be a big production. You can say, like, my students don't do great when, they have people behind them in class. Like, it makes some of my students anxious. So we're going to put the desk in a horseshoe. Done. There's simple things that you can do. And that's not going to harm the kiddo who doesn't care that someone's behind them. What's wrong with a horseshoe? Nothing, just good teaching.
Don't we make things much more complicated than it needs to be? I mean, so. That's what I hear you say, right?
So I get it. I used to do it. So I understand.
It's just like the mystical guided reading. I remember thinking, no, really, it's not really that. It's just make sure you're listening to kids. And, the guided reading's kind of out the window at this point anyway, nonetheless. But I tell you how I describe trauma-informed is the lens in which I look at those 5 core competencies of social and emotional learning.
There you go.
I just understand that it's a lens that I'm using to get to those 5 core competencies with kids, because at the end of the day, it doesn't matter if a kid has experienced trauma, right? It does matter, but it doesn't matter on how I interact with kids. It doesn't matter on the outcomes that I want. It matters that they had impacted, but it doesn't change how I behave or I respond.
Of course, right.
Because that's who I am. So, how do you see, when we're talking social emotional learning, there's been a lot of work over the last several years, a lot of work around these conversations. And how do you have conversations about some of the things we've always done or used to do? And what are some of those conversations that you have, like, hey, let's talk about this, and let's talk about maybe how we can do it differently or not at all.
Sure. So right now I'm a coach, like I said. So it's tricky because that's kind of my role, is to walk in and kind of like observe and see and have some input. So it can be a little awkward. It also depends on if it's a teacher that is way more seasoned in the classroom than me as well. And what I say is always like, hey, I'm with you. I'm in your corner. I want to observe kind of how you teach and what you're teaching, just style and philosophy and how you interact with kids, because it might be different from the way I would do it because we're two completely different people, right? Maybe I've never taught the same grade as you. I've certainly never taught these children myself because they're in your class. And I kind of want to see how it goes. So once I get a sense of who that teacher is, it gives me a little bit more of an idea of how I can walk up to them and say like, hey, instead of thinking about, always giving Matthew this break when you feel like he's getting really fidgety and you think like, oh, I know that he needs more of a break, that's fine. And you can give Matthew the opportunity to say like, hey, go take a break in the calm corner when you feel like you need it. Give the whole class a break. Add in some movement for the whole group. This can be tier 1. If Matthew might be fidgety and needs a break, Allie over there, who's kind of holding it together, might also need a break. It just shows up a little differently, right? So kind of adding those things in to allow them to say like, if Allie is maybe feeling the same way Matthew is, and it's just not showing up the same, their body language is different, etc., you're actually probably saving yourself some instructional time and some, potential needs of that child later on in the day if we kind of just address it right now. So teachers are a little bit more receptive to that kind of concept, especially when I'm able to show them. So there have been times when I've been able to go in and say like, hey, this is what I'm talking about. Like, let me show you. And I'll do some modeling because, again, it also, with me being a coach and me being a special ed teacher, there are things that these general education teachers that I'm working alongside know that I don't know about content and things that I'm just like, oh, that is so not my expertise. And this is my expertise. So I would want them to model that for me. If this was like, hey, you're teaching fractions in a really confusing way, I would absolutely want that person to model that for me. So I feel like it would likely be the same way. So with permission, I love to do that for teachers, to sort of like break down that extra wall, like remove the veil and just be like, this is what I'm talking about. Oh, that's really easy. Yeah, it totally is. Super simple. And just kind of giving them that way to break it down can be helpful.
You said something while you were talking. It was like, if we do things now, it saves time later. And I think that's a conversation that I have. People ask me all the time, how do you have time to do all these things in your school? And my response is, how do we not have time? Like, we schedule morning gatherings every morning. We have afternoon gatherings at the end of every day. We have lunch bunches for kids who aren't struggling with behavior. Like, these are things that this is what we do. We teach, right? We build capacity. And it's not just around ELA, math, science, and social studies. It's around life. Like, these are, people always say soft skills. I'm like, no, these are life skills. These are actually what you do.
I don't like that term either.
I don't either. Man, it drives me nuts.
I don't really get it either. Like, what does that mean? But yeah, because we also know that math, science, social studies, reading, like, those are so important, right? Exceptionally important. So if we want them to be able to be like their best selves, their brains are ready, they're ready to go, everyone probably has time for that. How many times have you been like, Allie, get out your book. Allie, get out your book.
Mm-hmm.
Allie, pick your head up. Like, that's time. So like, if you're able to front load with some of these extra things and infuse this other stuff in, like, you have time to do that. Everybody does.
It's so funny when you're saying like, Matthew, do you need a break? And you're using me as an example. If my assistant principal is listening right now, she's like, he definitely needs a break. And I think the reason I connected this work is I was the kid. I was that kid that, like, I'm still that adult. Sure. I've been in IEP meetings, and I'm not joking you, where our school psychologist is like, Portel, you're shaking the whole table. And my legs just going 100 miles an hour. And I'm like, and one of those things that I think I've seen such a difference, and you may have some experience in this, is we use flexible seating in a lot of our classrooms.
Sure.
And how powerful simply just letting kids move in a freer way changes the whole culture of the classroom, decreases, I hate the word behavior, but increases like behaviors for kids What have you had experience in that with your career or with classrooms that you've worked with?
So I love that you brought that up because I feel like it kind of goes back to what I was saying, how there's different, obviously just different personalities of teachers. Like,
yeah, right.
Drive me crazy is when there's like a low buzz of just like chatter or kids just like talking. I'm like, oh, like my eye is twitching. Like it drives me bonkers, right? And so it's just one of those things. I'm like, let it go. It's not a big deal. You know, like I have to like consciously be like, okay, who cares?
Yeah.
But there are other things that teachers need to be able to say, who cares about? And those are teachers who don't like it when kids like can't sit down. And it might not be because they're like an impatient person. It's just like for some reason, like that's the one thing that like, that's going to drive me bonkers.
Yep.
And it's one of those things where you just have to be able to tell yourself like, who cares? You know, like who cares if Matthew is up, like pacing in the back when he's like, the answer's 12. It's like, Matthew's still here with you. He's just pacing the line you gave him. He's walking on it. It's not a big deal. Like Matthew's in the corners at his standing desk, kicking his leg around. Who cares? You know, you have to sometimes be able to just say, who cares? You know, like, does it matter? Is he still doing math? What's the goal? Math. Okay, great. That's happening. No one around him is like injured or like struggling majorly. Who cares? You know? So.
Oh, I remember being in the classroom and the principal that I worked under, it did drive her crazy when kids moved. And I had been trained in Kagan cooperative learning and had many, like my kids just like, it looked like a soccer game, like a professional soccer game. Like they were up and down. We were moving around. We were high-fiving. Like it was constant. And the kids loved it. And she'd be like, Cordell, like, I don't know how you.
Like, how do you know they're getting anything? Like, I got there with them. Like my class. Okay, so there's always this stigma, preconceived notion. I don't know that sometimes in special ed classrooms, like the kids don't do anything. You know, there's like that old school mentality, like, well, they don't really do anything. Well, a lot of times people think that the kids are in there like coloring or doing puzzles. But the thing is, people would walk in my classroom, the kids were always coloring and always doing puzzles. And I'm like, and we're learning. I would let them do that. I'm like, on top of the coloring, they're also like actively doing what I'm doing. They just like, and so a lot of my kids did have a lot of, they had a traumatic background, the majority of my students. So like to give them the ability that like when they got frustrated, like this is calming, I can do this, was great for them. And you know what, if they missed every sixth word to what I said, like, okay, but they're still in the classroom and we're all still here and we're all still doing math. So like, that's a win for me. So it was funny when people come in, they're like, all your kids are coloring. I'm like, yeah, but ask them what we're doing. Like, it's fine. You know, I had to get over that hump, you know, like it did kind of drive me a little crazy at the beginning. Like, this is weird, but I was like, I don't know. I think it's going to work. And for a lot of kids, it did.
So let's talk about getting over humps and paradigm shifting, because paradigm shift's kind of the name of anyways. But paradigm shifting, because I think I've seen a lot of your posts and I've seen a lot of your philosophies, and we had like a little pre-conversation around the difference of transactional and relational interactions, primarily around PBIS.
Sure.
And I know that PBIS right now it's in a lot of conversations and a lot of shifting of paradigms and a lot of schools of saying it's not about the interaction, it's about the connection, right?
Right.
What's your experience with that in potentially shifting paradigms or having one yourself?
Sure. So I guess when I first learned about PBS, it sounded great. like, man, this is awesome. And it kind of reminds me of when I heard about the No Child Left Behind Act.
Yes.
Oh, that's great. Of course,
good analogy.
Children left behind. Like, who would want that? You know, it sounds ideal. Of course. Like, this is wonderful. You give a kid a ticket and then all is well in the universe. Like, give them 100 tickets. That sounds great, you know? But like everything sounds good on paper. But then when you see it in action, you're like, oh, this is pretty problematic, you know? And that's really what I have seen with PBIS. And I mean that in many senses, especially when it comes to like culturally responsive teaching. I've watched PBIS go sideways and seen it go sideways. And I do understand, especially coming from a special education background, that there is a lot of benefit and some merit to teaching children to be extrinsically motivated and what that feels like before they can sort of understand and comprehend that like intrinsic motivation. And I totally get that. There's a place and a time for that. And certain students, that's what they need. And that's what it's all about, right? I would say that like as a tier 1 intervention, I don't really think that that's the case, you know? So I think it's important that we see things for what they are, and that we're able to not be so attached to something like PBIS that we can't just say like, hey, let me give that a second to think about, you know, like let me give myself the opportunity to like at least ruminate on that. Like maybe I'm obsessed with PBIS, but like maybe I could just think about it for a minute. And I think that's something that like we have to be able to do, to be able to say like, if I really want what's best for kids, I need to be able to dissect things at least a little, to be able to sort of understand where someone else on the other side might be coming from.
I mean, it's just like the idea of the clip charts, and I'm not gonna like pretend I didn't use one when I first started teaching. But I will tell you that in my first year teaching, I got to like mid-year, I'm like, I don't need this thing. Like,
yeah, like
we just canned it. Like I was a teacher of English learners, and like we just canned it. But at the end of the day, there's things that are so ingrained in what we do that it's just what we do, and we don't really stop and pause and go, why are we doing it? What you just said, like, wait, why can't this, right? And I think that there have been many guests on this podcast, Dr. Ross Green, Dr. Bruce Perry, Dr. Mona Delahook, a lot of people who have talked about the science behind this of looking away from behavior modification to skill building, right? To support. And I think you talk about that emotion, or the emotional vocabulary of building that for kids. Tell me about that, because I'm a firm believer in that as well. And then what do you do once you teach them the vocabulary? What do you do after that?
Sure. So I think that's just the biggest piece. It's like kids need to be able to say like what they need. So we need to also teach kids to advocate for themselves. And sometimes that honestly means, especially with our younger kids, like, so how do you feel? What do you need? What do you think you need right now? Or like later after, let's say they have a moment where, you know, this math worksheet is just overwhelming. My frustration tolerance is at a 0 and I'm just really struggling. And it comes out in a ton of different ways.
And you're talking about the teacher, right? I'm kidding. Go ahead.
Sometimes, right?
No, I know.
And so this kiddo's just like majorly struggling. So then afterwards, we're not going to miss the opportunity to talk about it, even though sometimes I think teachers, and it's so tempting to just be like, that was in the past, and I would really rather not bring that back up because that was pretty ugly. That felt really bad. But we have to. I think that's essential. It helps rebuild our relationship as a student and a teacher, and it helps kids be able to say like, how did I feel? What happened? And then what worked? What didn't work? And it helps them kind of like make those connections. Like, who did that hurt when that kind of thing happens? Like, how did this affect, you know? And that's a good thing for kids to be able to see. Honestly, it's a good thing for me to think about as a teacher too, when certain things happen, like, shoot, when I responded like that, what happened? Like we got sidetracked, so-and-so got distracted. I had to pull another teacher out of here because maybe it was something that like I did that escalated the situation, because we all do that. And
absolutely,
we got to think about it and like, okay, let's reflect. If we're going to do that, we need to help our students do it. So when they do it, being able to say, okay, what worked? Even writing it down, like, okay, the last time that I felt frustrated when I went and got a drink of water, it really helped me. Okay, well then I know that's part of my coping toolbox. I can try that when I'm frustrated. This often helps. Or that didn't help. Or like it helps with math, but then when I'm mad about a friend, that doesn't really help me. Okay, so we know we can, you know, put things in different boxes, and it's just, we need to do that. And we also as teachers need to model it. Constantly remind kids, help them, show them what that looks like.
You know, it's interesting because I always tell people in elementary school, that's where I'm a principal and I've spent the majority of my career, is that kids have 4 emotions really: happy, mad, sad, and hungry. That's it. They come into elementary school happy, sad, mad, and hungry. And you'll have a kid that's frustrated and he'll say, or he or she'll say, I'm so mad. And I'm like, actually, let's talk about what does that mean, mad? And then we start narrowing down. In our at the school that I lead, we teach emotional vocabulary as a foundation.
Sure.
Because kids have to be able to appropriately express themselves in order to feel heard, right? If I'm just constantly saying I'm mad, at some point people are going to be like, okay, you're mad all the time, but that isn't actually the emotion. And then that building the skills of teaching self-regulation. And I know without a doubt, as an exceptional ed teacher, especially as an exceptional ed teacher who has worked with students with the label of emotional disturbance, that had to be the foundation of you as a teacher. It has to be, right?
I mean, it's essential. And I mean, I'll say I'm a person before when I was in therapy, talking to my therapist, she'd be like, well, how do you feel? I'm like, I don't know. Well, how'd you feel when that happened? I don't know. And I'm like, wow, I guess I'm really not so great at knowing how I feel. Those emotion wheels are super powerful because you look through it and you're like, man, I think I was really scared, but I guess I didn't realize that. Like, that was like kind of scary for me. So I got like super defensive and angry. And it's like, okay, because I was scared. So that kind of thing, it helped me kind of realize like, wow, if somebody in second grade had really helped me to sort of parse that out. And it doesn't need to be the social worker and it doesn't mean to be the school counselor. It could be, but it could also be the PE teacher and the lunch lady and the assistant principal. It could be everyone in the building who's using this as like, this isn't someone else's territory. This is all of our territory because this is how kids are successful. You know, this is how we function.
Well, and as a school leader, it works the same with adults. I'm not even going to, I mean, it is. And I've learned that like my role as a school administrator, I'm still a teacher. I'm still a coach. I was a structural coach for many years. I'm still in that role. And I think that the idea of shame plays such a huge role in schools with adults, with principals, with kids, with parents, that is such a powerful emotion that by design, our system is built to shame schools, principals, teachers, and kids. And that to me blows my mind that is the basis. When the list comes out of all the schools where you are, now you're in the bottom and now you should feel bad because you are, like, everything is built on this idea of shame, when we've got to shift that paradigm all the way from the boardroom all the way down to the classroom. Because
absolutely, man,
I mean, is that been your experience too?
Yes, and it's overwhelming. And I've been in now 3 different school districts. And then when I was a special ed consultant, I mean, I was in many schools. You know, whether I knew about boards and stuff, like sometimes yes, sometimes no, but I had my feet in a lot of school buildings and in a lot of different classrooms. And yes, I've seen that as well. And it's like, shame is so powerful. It's such a powerful tool. And it's not a good one.
No.
It can happen so quickly. And the thing is, sometimes we shame or feel shamed. And it's generally unintentional if you're coming from a healthy place. And sometimes it's very intentional. Let's just say it's not intentional. Once you see it happen, you got to repair it. And can it be repaired? Of course, but also it's not going to be in one conversation. It needs to be repeated behavior so people can believe you. And that being colleagues and that being kids. We need to practice also apologizing and owning up to kids, their parents, and our colleagues.
Oh my goodness, yes. Like that is, yes, the foundation, right? And I think, and I've been talking about this a lot when I do speak, when I'm not at school, but when I speak out, is about the intent versus an outcome, right? I've never met an educator that had the intent of getting into schools to shame children. Like, I've never met one. I've met literally thousands. But sometimes our intent doesn't actually match the outcome. And I've seen in spaces and I'm not, this is not to use to be shame, but it's a use to the lens shift that we have to have, where is what we got into education grounded for, is that the outcome that we're pushing towards, where kids feel safe, nurtured, loved, connected. And at the end of the day, if not, then we have to reevaluate.
Yes.
And I mean, I've never met a teacher that's like, I'm going to just break these children down from the moment I walk into the class, right? So you really believe this to the point where you actually wrote a book.
I did.
Right? And hold on, I got to show you. You've got someone on here that apparently wants to know a little bit more.
I think I lost you, Matthew. Hopefully he comes back quickly.
Ta-da!
You're back. I was like, oh no, I lost you.
That's the first time that's ever happened. So welcome to the Trauma Informed Educator Network podcast, where I kick myself off of my own. I was so excited to get Carmen's comment up here that I don't even know what I hit. I'm not even gonna
it's
lie.
back to school season. Give yourself some grace.
Well, and let me tell you, Allie, Carmen was there, and I know Carmen. We just got done with a 3-day conference, and literally yesterday. So I'm a little tired. I'm not going to joke about it. But Carmen says, Allie, I love your picture book. It's so important. Are you writing more? So first, let's tell about your book, and then let's find out the answer to that question.
So my book, if I was, being a really good sales lady, I'd have it in front of me, but I don't. But it's called Roaring Mad Riley. And Riley is a dinosaur this is a book designed for, I would say, children probably ages 3 to maybe 7. And it can scale up, scale down, kind of depending on how you read it. The skills are for everybody, including adults. So, as we've talked about, most coping skills, just kind of cross the age span. But so Riley's at school and her block tower gets knocked over accidentally by a friend, and Riley gets super roaring mad. And, her face gets red and she gets really angry. And her teacher, Mr. Rex, walks her through hey, super cool that you're angry. We all get angry, really normal. But when we hurt people and we do things that could, we might eventually, he doesn't really use this word, but we might regret, there's other things we can do. There's safer alternatives, and teaches Riley some coping skills. And, so Riley pays attention to her body sensations, how she feels, and she becomes calmer. And at the end, sort of how we talked about, maybe I'm not mad. Maybe I'm actually really disappointed because I worked really hard on that. That tower was pretty tall and now it's gone. And I'm I'm frustrated. I'm disappointed. And her friend that knocked it down helps her build a taller one. So at the end of the book, what I really love about it is there's a ton of strategies. And my mind was more thinking of those grownups at home that were sort of I always put it through the lens of my dad. My dad is a super loving guy. He's great, loved being a dad. But my dad worked for the gas company for 35 years. So my dad has no background in working with children. He's just the first kids I really knew were my nieces and nephews and my own kids. So when my kid threw a temper tantrum, I don't know what to do. I have no training. My gas company training is not going to serve me well here. So these tools in the back are for my dad, and the other grownups at home that are sort of I don't know what to do when my kids do this. What are some ways that I can use this book with questions and things we can talk about, discussion starters, other relatable activities, other books, some, places that I would say hey, go learn more information at this website. They're wonderful places I really admire and would send anyone to. So it's been really fun. And I love the illustrations too. I had a fabulous illustrator that I worked with that really helped it all come to life. So
Carmen wants to know, is there more? Is there going to be more?
So I would love to write more books. I will be honest, I don't really have one in the works currently, but I have a lot of ideas up here. So Carmen, hold tight.
Yes. And I think that when you're talking about these strategies, I think that those strategies aren't just for parents, right? But that's who you had in mind. Sure. So if there are teachers listening here and they're like, hey, I want to know more, because that's usually why people listen. They want to learn, right? And some people like to walk in the morning, I've heard, and listen to this podcast. So what are some strategies that you can get little bites of from the book? What are some things you advise as a SEL coach to others?
Sure. So I think the biggest piece is when it comes to coping skills, I think a lot of people think that deep breaths are that's the coping skill. It's a coping skill. But I'll say for me specifically, if I'm really really upset, I'm super dysregulating, deep breathing is not really going to do much for me. I do believe there's probably people out there who are man, if I take some big deep breaths, it clears my mind. I don't think a lot of kids that's true for if they're super dysregulated.
Right.
And for me, I definitely can say that's not me. And so I think a big piece that we need to think about is we need to teach coping skills, a huge variety of them. And if you check out like my blog, you read my book, you look at, I mean, you could Google it. There's hundreds, right? When it comes from drawing, coloring, blowing bubbles, singing a song, thinking of a happy memory, listening to music, taking a rest, closing your eyes. You know, there's so many little.
Tearing up paper is one of our kids' favorite. Right.
Oh, jumping, doing some exercises, right? There's so many like wonderful coping skills out there. And I always help teachers think about this by thinking like, do you have a friend who deep cleans their house when they're feeling really anxious? Oh, yeah. I will probably never be that person. I'm not.
My wife is. I am far from it.
That's not me. Yeah. I'm not type A. And I think a lot of people who are a little bit more on the type A side are like, oh, I can control this. I'm going to organize my whole house. I totally get it. I also have friends who are like, I'm going to go run 12 miles because I'm really frustrated. Also not me. I'm also not going to do that. But I do know that those are coping skills that work for other people, but that's not what I do. So that's a good example to be able to think like, oh, some people do that. Yes. And you know them. We all know people that do different things. Like I go to the gym and work out for an hour and a half when I'm frustrated or feeling overwhelmed or stressed. And if you don't do that, that's a good example of like, okay, well then a kid who maybe relies on art or closing their eyes in the corner for 20 minutes to help them, like that might not be every kid. So we need to make sure that we're teaching a variety of coping skills when kids are at their baseline. So I like to add into like a morning meeting, perhaps like, oh, this week we're going to practice doing like some like little Zen doodles at our desk. So then you can kind of pull that out like, oh, did you try a Zen doodle? If you're feeling frustrated because your worksheet's right here, you could do a Zen doodle on the back, you know, giving, you know, kids opportunities to be able to experience lots of different coping skills. And as a teacher, also modeling them.
I love the teaching kids when they're at their baseline, and Bruce Perry's work is really deep in that regulate, relate, reason. Yep. Like I give the scenario all the time. My mom passed away a few months ago. I'm not trying to get like dark or anything, but she passed away, and I always say, and it was very challenging, a very challenging experience. But I always say, if somebody came up to me and said, "Hey, I need you to sit down and be quiet, really quick," that couldn't have happened. There's no way, right? And yet we do that to kids all the time, like. Shh, go sit down and be quiet. No. Like, what can I do for you? I'm staying in this space. Do you need me to do this? No, I had to go through that process and do those, but those were skills that I had learned, right?
Of course.
And I love that you're saying you have to teach a variety, because kids, what works for you may not work for me. What works for him may not work for me. What works for her may not work for me. At the end of the day, what works for us and the way we learn or the way we process may not be the way that kids experience those same things. So that's so powerful. And I hope people really take that away. I'm going to quote you on the teach kids coping skills when they're at their baseline. Yep. Because that is as fundamental as it gets. And you can't teach kids when they are completely dysregulated. It does not happen.
No, at that point, it's really just kind of like, zip it and, you know, use visuals if you really need to, and like talk to them after.
Yeah. You know, I don't know how many times I've said,
I always do, you know, I
say to kids all the time, I'm going to be over here. And as soon as you're ready, take the time you need. You just give me thumbs up. You don't have to sing, just give me thumbs up. And that in itself has helped so many kids. And I will wait them out. I'll just hang out and give them their space. Some kids want space. Some kids don't want space. It's that relationship building, right? Like figure out what works for them. Yeah. There was another thing that you said too, Allie, that resonated with me. And that is being apologizing to kids.
Yeah.
And I think one of those pieces is also expressing your emotions. So I do this all the time. When they have to come into my office, which is very rarely because I normally go to them, but nonetheless, when they're in there, I'll say things like, I'm really frustrated right now, so I need a minute. So if you could just give me a minute, I've got to get myself back to calm so I can make sure I'm in the right space so we can talk. And you'll see kids' eyes, they're like, I can't believe he just said that. Like, and that modeling piece is so important for kids. So talk about that when you're talking about teacher self-care and modeling and practicing what we preach in front of kids. Talk about that as your experience as a teacher and what you coach people around.
Yeah. So the reason why I learned that was obviously from experience. And I will say, when I taught in this residential treatment center / therapeutic day school, whatever, it was all of the above. I only had like 4 to 5 students at a time, which is a really small class. But I'll say some of those kids like carried a lot. So like their personalities would fill up the room, and I had 28 kids all of a sudden.
Absolutely.
And it depended on the day. Some days I was like, wow, this is like a little dream in here. And I loved it because every day posed different challenges. But some days the challenges, I was like, holy moly. Like, when is it 3 o'clock? Because like it feels like it's been noon for 6 hours, like what is going on with this day, And yeah, some days it's just they're harder than others. And the kids live together. So it's like a lot of them are like it's like going things like just
right. It's like it truly is like a family.
Kind of
a lot of baggage and barriers and
dynamics, just like, and then some kids who then just like live with their families and then come in. But you guys are like live together, but like I live with my mom and dad, just like
what an interesting perspective. Yeah.
So like just really interesting. And then I had to really learn that, like, what do you do with this? Because like you two are angry at each other now, but like you're gonna go spend the next 4 hours together. Like you're gonna break from each other. Like I'm going home. Like you're not, you're at home. So it's just very interesting. But so for teacher self-care, a lot of it was like, okay, I would set up this like gorgeous calm corner in the center of my classroom. And I would, in my eyes, had explicitly taught the children
how to
use this. I'm like, certainly they all know. They can spit it all back out to me. And what was happening was they're all going to the calm corner and like throwing stuffed animals in the air and like tearing things off the walls just to see what I would do. And I'm like, okay, this isn't what I pictured.
Right.
This isn't being used the way I wanted it to. So then I started to say like, okay, well, my self-care is going out the window because I'm frustrated with you.
Right.
So now no one's happy right now. Like I'm annoyed.
Right.
Clearly annoyed because you're not listening to me and you're over here like goofing around in the calm corner. Like what's happening? And if somebody really needs it, now it's occupied by you who's goofing around in here. Like this isn't working. So I started, when I would get frustrated, saying like, I need some time in the calm corner, and I would go use it, sit in the beanbag chairs, and the kids are like looking around like, what is she doing?
Yeah.
And I'm using the calm corner and I'm showing them, I'm looking at the visuals on the wall, like, okay, I'm going to try this. I'm going in here and I'm pulling this thing out and I'm squeezing a stress ball and I'm doing this and I'm setting a timer like, okay, I'm only going to use 4 minutes. And, sometimes I would like talk it through out loud,
sure,
like
of course.
Like a think aloud, like you would with a book. Right. And it really helped. And so for a lot of students, I'm like, okay, like this isn't like a get out of jail free card. Like just because you're in the calm corner doesn't mean you're not like here with us. So when you're done, I'll catch you up on what we were talking about. Like not expecting you to listen to my lesson when you're over here, like you're taking care of your like emotional needs. I'll catch you back up. And then so the kids kind of understood like, oh, when I'm in here, it's not like I'm missing math. This isn't like my escape necessarily. Like she's gonna have me like learn this math lesson afterwards. And those kind of things really helped. And it helped my sanity in a way too, because I'm like, okay, like I can give myself a minute to honestly like take a break in here. I know I'm modeling for kids. It all kind of like rounded itself out. So that was like a fun way that I always did it. And just that explicit teaching, I think, is essential too. Just like having them watch you using these things in real time.
And I think that comes to when there is a mistake made and there may be harm done.
Sure.
It's the same concept. They have to repair, right? Kids have to repair the harm, and we have to teach. I'll tell you, we had just at the end of the year post, and we were back even during the end of COVID, and we had a child that loved to tell people to F off. She was in 3rd grade. And I mean, that was just her go-to. And so, of course, I could have reprimanded her and give her all these consequences. Instead, we just taught her. Like, she had some with some sessions with our school counselor. We just like, hey, when you do this, like, let's talk about what happens. It only took 2 weeks, and she quit telling people to F off. And I was like, I mean, that's it. And we're just teaching. Like, we're not hammering out punishment. We're just teaching. And I think at the end of the day, those modeling and teaching pieces are the key around social and emotional learning / health / trauma informed, whatever we want to call it.
Yeah.
It's around humanizing kids and supporting them to teach them or provide them opportunities to learn whatever works for them, because we know that it is what we have to do. So let's talk about, if people want to get your book, if they want to follow you on social media, if they want to find you anywhere, where can they locate you?
So the best place and like my hub for all of that would be my website, which is www.missbehaviorblog.com, and miss like MISS. Missbehaviorblog.com. You'll see tons of blog posts. I blog every week. I've got some really cool people who have also contributed to my blog. We had, and you would be super interested in this, a former foster youth who's also now a foster parent, who just shared about, how can we support foster families? Like, that's kind of a cool thing. And I love being able to have people that have expertise that's different from me. We have a physical therapist who's going to be sharing stuff soon, like things that we're like, okay, yeah, I have some some knowledge on this topic, but I can't blog post on it, but I know that my audience would be super interested in learning more. These are people and kids and circumstances that we all experience. So it's kind of a fun aspect to my blog too, to check out. And you can find me on Instagram, which is where I'm definitely most active, and how we kind of connected to each other, at _misbehavior on Instagram.
Y'all, is that not the best Instagram hand? MISS behavior _@. I mean, _@_. Anyway, that to me, I'm like, but if I put like at Mr. Behavior, it does not, like, I'm like, it's the whole misbehavior play on the words. I love it. It's awesome. Probably because I've always been misbehaving. Nonetheless, thank you so much. So I always ask one question. I want to ask you one more, and I don't tell people that I ask them this. So what do you want educators to know right now? We literally are like a week and a half from coming back. I know you've got probably about 4 weeks.
Yeah.
What do you want teachers to know right now?
What do I want teachers to know right now? We have some kids that haven't been to school in over a year. So I think that's just really important to remember. Like, we have had kids who haven't been physically to school in over a year. That's a really long time, especially if we're talking about kids who are in like 4th or 5th grade and have had multiple years under their belt of that not being the case. So I think it's important that we go in with that mindset, knowing that like, we're going to have to really explicitly teach a lot of behaviors, that are just like, you would think that they're common sense, about like walking in the hallway or standing in line, or like, hey, before you talk, like, you might want to raise your hand, or like stand up, or whatever, your classroom vibe is, and making sure that we're kind of being sensitive to that, because these are children and they haven't been to school in a really long time.
Good advice. And I will tell you, as someone who's led a school, that we went out, we came back, we went out, and we came back. I called it the only year I've ever had 4 first days of school. And it felt like that.
To do that. We don't know how to do it.
But we did it because that's what educators do. We do it because that's what we do.
Yeah.
I hope we don't have to do it again.
I hope we don't either. But if we do, it's just,
we'll do it.
Give yourself grace too. It's okay to not know how to do that, because how would we know how to do this?
Absolutely. Well, thank you for being on here. And for everyone who tuned in live, thank you so much for being here. For those of you who were just at the Trauma Informed Educators Network conference on Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday, to say that I left motivated and then just on fire. And then I got to talk to Allie, like, bring on 21-22 school year. I am ready. I am fired up. And I hope that you as educators are too. And please, 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 I know I was on a hiatus for about 2.5, 3 weeks. I'll be back every other week until now, and hopefully until January. So please stay tuned. And as always, please, please, please wash your hands. And if you need to, wear a mask. All right, we're still live, but I had to turn off the recording. So
thanks for
I don't know what happened to the whole thing. For those of you who are still on here, we're going to jump off here. But I appreciate you all being on here live and listening. And Allie, thank you again for sharing your expertise. If you'll stay on just 1 second. Yeah, it's a great comment. I told you it'd go really fast.
Yeah, it always does, this kind of stuff.
Well, and I have to admit, it's been a while since I've heard a good Illinois accent, so I felt like I was talking
I have a Chicago accent.
You do have a Chicago, yeah. So it felt good because this is like, it was like talking from somebody from home. So thank you guys on live. Allie, if you'll stay on just 1 second, and we'll see you all next week.